Now, when one talks about living organisms in their environment, it's important to talk about ecology. So, ecology is the study of the relationships between organisms and their environment and the balances between these relationships. And for the sake of this lesson, it's important to understand a few ecological terms. So, first of all, the term environment, we're going to hear that a lot throughout this lesson. An environment is the combination of factors that surround and act upon an organism. So, these factors can be divided into two groups. You have your biotic factors, and these are all the living organisms that are present, such as predator, prey, competitors, parasites, pathogens. And then you have your abiotic factors, which are all the non-living chemical and physical factors. And we're going to get into that a bit more later on in this lesson. Then we also have the term habitat. A habitat is a place where a particular organism lives. So, for example, the habitat of an earthworm is the upper layers of the soil. The term species talks about a group of organisms of common ancestry that closely resemble each other and are normally capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. A population is all the members of a particular species living together in a particular habitat. So, for example, all the sea urchins living in a seagrass bed form a population. Now, a community is all the populations of different species living together in a particular habitat. So, for example, in a woodland community, which consists of plants, animals, and decomposers, that is a community. Then an ecosystem is a community of living organisms interacting with each other and with their abiotic environment. So an example of an ecosystem is a pond, a coral reef, a mangrove swamp, or grassland or forest. Those are ecosystems. And lastly, we have the term niche. So a niche is the position or role an organism plays within an ecosystem. So for example, the earthworm's niche is to burrow through the soil, improving its aeration, drainage, and fertility. That is its specific role as an organism in an ecosystem. Now let's briefly look at some sampling techniques for when you're carrying out an ecological study. And here we have 4 techniques that are used. The first one being observation, second quadrates, then line transects, and then belt transects. Now observation is pretty self-explanatory. So the ecosystem should first be observed, and the common species of plants and animals will be recorded. Any adaptations that enable the organisms to survive in the ecosystem should be noted, together with any interrelationships that is noticed between the organisms. So the only thing needed to carry out observation is just your 2 eyes, you observing, looking at what you're seeing, and making notes of the species that are there and the relationships between them. The next technique is called quadrates, the use of a quadrate. Now, what is a quadrate? A quadrate is a square frame whose area is usually known, so it can be maybe 0.25 meters squared or 1 meter squared, and it is placed at random several times within the ecosystem. The number of individuals of each species of plant and stationary or slow-moving animal found within the quadrate is then counted. If it is not possible to distinguish individual plants of a species, example grass, the quadrate can be made into a grid using string, and the percentage of the quadrate area covered can be estimated. Quadrants are used typically for the study of distribution and abundance of plants and stationary or slow-moving animals in uniform ecosystems, example, in a grassland. And we can see an image here of what a quadrate really is. And so you see that you have a uniform area of land that is covered, and then that area is then divided into equal parts, and the constituents or the organisms found within are then noted. Now, a line transect is usually a measuring tape or string that has marks at equal regular intervals. So, for example, every 10 centimeters or every 25 centimeters. It is placed in a straight line across an ecosystem, and the species and plants and stationary or slow-moving animals touching the line are recorded. Line transects are particularly useful where there is a transition of organisms across an ecosystem. So, for example, down a rocky seashore, they give a quick idea of the species presence and how they change across the ecosystem. And here we have a diagram of an example of a line transect, and we can see how the species of plant change as we move along the line. Next, we have a belt transect, and a belt transect is a strip of fixed width, so it can be 0.5 meters or 1 meter, made by placing parallel line transects across an ecosystem. The species found between the lines are then recorded. Alternatively, a quadrat can be placed alongside one of the line transects, and the number of individuals of each species can be found within its boundaries. The quadrat is then moved along the line, and counting is repeated at regular intervals. Now, these techniques can be used to help you to estimate the population size of a particular species. Using the results from your quadrat, you will be able to obtain the species density. This is the average number of individuals of a given species per meter squared. If the quadrat is 1 meter squared, it is obtained by dividing the total number of individuals of the species by the number of quadrats used. The quadrat can also give you information about the total population of the number of individuals of a given species in the area on the study. It is obtained by multiplying the species density by the total area of the ecosystem studied. The results from using a quadrat can also give you information about the species covered. This is the percentage of ground covered by a given species. It is used if the percentage of the quadrat area covered was estimated. If the quadrat is 1 meter squared, it is obtained by dividing the total percentage of ground that the species has covered by the number of quadrats used. Then finally, the results from the use of the quadrat can also give you information about the species frequency. This is the percentage of quadrats in which the given species was found. The population size can also be estimated using the capture-recapture method. Now, this is used to estimate the population sizes of moving animals. So a representative sample of animals of a species is collected. The animals are counted and each one is marked, example with a dot of paint or with a marker. The animals are then released back into the same area and given time to mix with the original population. A second sample is then collected, counted, and the number of marked organisms are counted. The population size is then estimated. So using this equation, the estimated population size is the number of organisms in the first sample times the number of organisms in the second sample divided by the number of marked organisms recaptured. And here we can see equations kind of summing up what each of these different points stand for. Now let's take a look at the impact of abiotic factors on living organisms. Abiotic factors are extremely important in determining the types and number of organisms that exist in a given environment. That is, they influence the distribution and behavior of living organisms. These factors can be divided into the following. They can either be edaphic factors, meaning to do with the soil. They can be climatic factors, doing with the climate, or they can be aquatic factors dealing with the water that is present in that environment. Now, let's take a closer look at the edaphic factors. These are factors that are connected with the soil. So soil is just a mixture of inorganic rock particles, water, air, mineral salts, organic matter, and living organisms, including plant roots, small animals, and microorganisms. Soil provides organisms living in it with water, oxygen, nitrogen, and mineral nutrients. The different components within the soil has an impact on the living organisms that are found in or around it. So the texture of the soil influences the water content of the soil. The smaller the soil particles, the more water held by capillarity and chemical forces, and the higher the water content. The texture of the soil also influences the air content of the soil. So the larger the soil particles, the larger the air spaces, and the higher the air content. The texture also influences the mineral ion content of the soil. So the smaller the soil particles, the harder it is to leach, and the higher the mineral content. And then finally, the texture influences how easy it is for plant roots to penetrate and animals to burrow through the soil. The larger the soil particles, the easier to penetrate and burrow through. Next, the water content of the soil, which is obtained from rainfall and held in a thin film around soil particles by capillarity and chemical forces, is essential for photosynthesis in plants. Not only that, it helps to dissolve minerals so that they can be absorbed by plant roots. It also prevents desiccation or drying out of soil organisms without waterproof body coverings, for example, earthworms. Next, the air content in the soil is essential because the oxygen in the air is essential for aerobic respiration in plant roots and soil organisms. The oxygen in the air is necessary for the bacteria and fungi to decompose organic matter aerobically to form humus. The air content in the soil is also important because nitrogen in the air is necessary for nitrogen-fixing bacteria to form inorganic nitrogenous compounds. For example, nitrates. The mineral nutrients in the soil, which are formed from decomposing organic matter and by dissolving the surrounding rock, present as ions dissolved in soil water, and they're essential for healthy growth of plants, and we're going to see a bit more of that later on. The pH of the soil mainly affects the availability of mineral ions for the plant. If the soil is too acidic or too alkaline, mineral ions become less available. And then finally, humus, which is formed by bacteria and fungi decomposing dead or waste organic matter, helps to improve the air content by binding soil particles together in small clumps called soil crumbs. It also improves the mineral iron content by adding minerals and absorbing and retaining minerals. It also improves the water content by absorbing and retaining water. Next, let's look at the climatic factors. So the climatic factors affecting terrestrial organisms include light, temperature, humidity, water availability, wind, and atmospheric gases. Light intensity and its duration affect living organisms. Light is essential for plants to make food by photosynthesis, and the rate of photosynthesis depends on light intensity. Light also synchronizes activities of plants and animals with the seasons, example flowering in plants and migration, hibernation, and reproduction in animals. The temperature is extremely important because most organisms can only survive within a certain narrow temperature range. At low temperatures, ice crystals may form in cells and damage them, and then at high temperatures, enzymes are denatured. Temperature affects the rate of photosynthesis and germination in plants, and the activity of animals. Example, many animals become dormant in low temperatures. The humidity of the environment affects the rate of transpiration in plants and evaporation of water from some animals. Terrestrial habitats receive water from precipitation from the atmosphere as rain, snow, sleet, and hail. Water is essential for life. Chemical reactions in cell and most life processes need water in order to take place. It is also essential for photosynthesis in plants. Wind is also another important abiotic factor on living organisms. The wind is essential for pollination and seed dispersal in many plants and may also influence migration of birds. It can affect the rate of transpiration in plants, the rate of evaporation of water from animals, and the growth of vegetation. For example, the branches on the windward side of trees in exposed places become stunted and deformed. And then the last climatic factor that we're going to discuss is atmospheric gases. So the air is a mixture of gases including nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and other pollutants. Oxygen is essential for aerobic respiration in almost all living organisms. Carbon dioxide is essential for photosynthesis in plants, and pollutant gases have negative effects on living organisms. Now let's look at the aquatic factors, or the factors related to the water or water availability in an environment. So the aquatic factors affect organisms living in aquatic habitat. So for example, in ponds, lakes, rivers, oceans, and coral reefs. Aquatic organisms are affected by light, temperature, water availability, pollutants in the same way as terrestrial organisms. They are also affected by other factors such as salinity, which refers to the concentration of salt in the water. Most aquatic organisms are adapted to survive in specific salinity and can only tolerate small changes. Some organisms are adapted to living in fresh water, while some are adapted to living in salt or seawater. Next, the water movement and wave action. So organisms living in rivers and streams are affected by the constant movement of water. Those living along ocean shorelines are exposed to wave action and to changing water levels as the tide changes. And those living in the ocean are affected by currents. And finally, let's look at the availability of dissolved oxygen. So aquatic organisms use oxygen dissolved in water for respiration. Oxygen levels in still or polluted water are often very low, whereas habitats exposed to moving water usually have sufficient oxygen.